There's a strange paradox that begins the moment an avoidant connects with someone who genuinely feels safe. For most of their life, they've mastered distance, not always consciously, but consistently. They know how to keep things light, how to stay in control, how to avoid the kind of emotional depth that demands vulnerability. And then you enter the picture and something doesn't follow the old pattern. You're not overwhelming. You're not chaotic. You don't force closeness or demand constant reassurance. In fact, you bring a kind of calm presence they're not used to. And logically, this should feel like relief. This should be easy, but it's not. Because what feels safe to you feels unfamiliar to the man, unfamiliar to the human mind, often registers as danger. So now they're caught in an internal contradiction they don't fully understand. On one hand, their nervous system is picking up something steady, grounded, and real. On the other hand, their conditioning is telling them this is where you lose control. This is where you get hurt. And when those two signals collide, safety and threat in the same space, it creates anxiety, not peace. That's why you'll notice something unusual in their behavior. They lean in and then they pull back. They open up slightly and then they shut down. It's not random, it's regulation. They're trying to manage an emotional intensity that doesn't come from you being unsafe, but from you being meaningful. Because here's the truth. Avoidants don't fear people, they fear what people represent. Dependence, exposure, the possibility of needing someone and not having control over the outcome. And when they meet someone they actually connect with, those fears don't disappear, they amplify. You become important. And importance to an avoidant is risk. For the first time, they're not just navigating a situation, they're confronting themselves. The strategies that once protected them, distance, detachment, emotional independence, start to feel insufficient because those strategies were built for avoiding pain, not for sustaining connection. And now they're standing in front of a connection that could be real, and they don't have a blueprint for how to stay in it. So instead of experiencing safety as comfort, they experience it as exposure. You see them, not just the surface, but the parts they've learned to keep hidden. And being seen like that can feel disarming. Not because you're judging them, but because they're no longer in control of how much of themselves is revealed. And control for an avoidant has always been the foundation of emotional survival. This is why they may start questioning things that don't need to be questioned. They may create distance where none is required. They may even convince themselves that something is missing, when in reality, what's missing is familiarity with a healthy dynamic. Chaos feels normal. Distance feels safe. So when something calm and secure shows up, it disrupts their internal reference point. It's not that they don't recognize your value, they do. That's the very reason this conflict exists. If you didn't matter, there would be no fear, no hesitation, no internal resistance. The fact that they feel unsettled is not a sign of disinterest. It's a sign that something real is happening beneath the surface. But here's the critical distinction. Just because someone feels something real doesn't mean they're ready to hold on to it. And that's where the tension lives. They've finally encountered a connection that doesn't require them to perform, to chase, or to defend. Yet instead of stepping into it fully, they hesitate. Because stepping into something real means stepping out of everything that once kept them safe. And most people don't abandon their survival patterns overnight, no matter how good the alternative looks. So when you see that push and pull, that subtle withdrawal after moments of closeness, understand what you're witnessing. You're not seeing a lack of feeling, you're seeing a conflict between the desire for connection and the fear of what that connection demands. And in that conflict lies the truth. Sometimes the very thing someone needs the most is the very thing they feel the least prepared to receive. And once that initial paradox takes hold, where safety feels unfamiliar and unfamiliar feels threatening, you begin to notice a second layer to the conflict. It's even more confusing because now it's not just about fear. It's about desire and resistance happening at the exact same time. They want to be around you. That part is real. They think about you. They feel pulled toward you. They experience moments where being close feels natural. even effortless. But almost as quickly as that closeness begins to deepen, something inside them interrupts it. Not because the feeling disappears, but because it intensifies. This is where most people misunderstand avoidance. They assume the distance means a lack of care. But in many cases, the opposite is happening. The stronger the emotional pull, the stronger the internal alarm system becomes. It's not designed to measure love, it's designed to detect vulnerability. So now they're living in two emotional realities at once. In one moment, they're fully present, engaged, open, even warm. And in the next, they're creating space, withdrawing or becoming difficult to read. From the outside, it looks inconsistent. From the inside, it feels necessary. Because closeness to them isn't just connection, it's exposure. Every time they feel themselves leaning in, there's an unconscious calculation happening. What does this cost me? What happens if I need this person? What happens if I need this person? What happens if I lose control? And those questions don't come from logic, they come from past experiences that taught them that emotional reliance can lead to pain, disappointment, or a loss of self. So they resist, not because they don't want you, but because they don't know how to want you without feeling like they're compromising something essential within themselves. This creates what looks like contradiction, but is actually a form of emotional self-regulation. They move closer to feel connected, then pull away to feel safe again. It's a rhythm, not a decision. And unless they've done the internal work to recognize it, they won't even be fully aware of why they're doing it. What makes this dynamic even more complex is that they often don't communicate this struggle. Not because they're trying to be misleading, but because they don't have the language for it. They just know that something feels right and wrong at the same time. And when a person can't explain their own emotional responses, they default to behavior. Distance becomes the explanation. Silence becomes the coping mechanism. So you might find yourself asking, if they care, why do they pull away? And the answer is uncomfortable, but important, because caring for them doesn't feel safe. They've spent years, sometimes decades, building an identity around independence, around not needing too much, not feeling too deeply, not relying too heavily. And now they're encountering a connection that challenges that identity at its core. Because you don't just offer presence, you invite depth. You don't just exist in their life, you begin to matter within it. And mattering introduces risk. Risk of loss, risk of disappointment, risk of emotional dependence. So they try to manage that risk the only way they know how, by controlling proximity. Getting close enough to feel, but not so close that they feel overwhelmed. Staying connected, but not fully invested. It's a delicate balance, and it rarely feels stable. And this is where the frustration often builds for both sides. You experience inconsistency. They experience internal conflict. You see mixed signals. They feel mixed emotions. But underneath all of it, there's a single truth holding this pattern together. They are trying to experience connection without losing their sense of control. And that's not something that can be sustained long-term without tension, because real connection doesn't operate on partial presence. It requires a level of emotional availability that contradicts everything they've learned to rely on. And until they reconcile that within themselves, the push and pull will continue, not as a reflection of your worth, but as a reflection of their unresolved relationship with vulnerability. So when you witness that closeness followed by distance, don't reduce it to confusion alone. Recognize it for what it is. A person standing at the edge of something real, wanting to step forward, but not yet trusting their ability to stay there. And that's the paradox. They crave the connection deeply, but resist the very love that could fulfill it. And as this push and pull continues, something even deeper begins to surface, something that has very little to do with you on the surface and everything to do with what you awaken beneath it. Because when an avoidant connects with someone who brings emotional depth, consistency, and presence, it doesn't just create attraction. It creates activation. You're not just another experience in their life, you become a mirror. And what you reflect back to them isn't always comfortable. It's not just your care or your attention, it's the parts of themselves they've spent years learning to suppress, ignore, or outrun. Every unresolved fear, every moment where vulnerability once led to pain, every belief they built around needing to stay guarded, those things don't disappear in the presence of connection. They rise to the surface. And when they do, it can feel overwhelming. Because now it's not just about liking someone or building something. It's about confronting internal patterns that were never meant to be questioned. Patterns that once protected them, but are now limiting their ability to experience something real. This is why you might notice that the closer you get, the more complicated their behavior becomes. It's not because the connection is weakening, it's because the internal pressure is increasing. You're getting closer to the core of what they've been avoiding, and that proximity brings discomfort. In psychology, there's a principle worth understanding. We don't just seek connection, we seek familiar emotional experiences. Even if those experiences are unhealthy, they feel predictable. They feel manageable. So when something healthier shows up, something grounded, stable, and emotionally available, it disrupts that familiarity. And disruption, even when it's positive, creates resistance. So your presence doesn't just offer them something new, it challenges everything they've normalized. If they've associated closeness with losing themselves, your consistency feels suspicious. If they've learned that emotional dependence leads to disappointment, your reliability feels temporary. If they've convinced themselves that they're better off alone, your connection begins to dismantle that belief. And that dismantling process is not gentle. It's internal friction. Because part of them is recognizing the truth: you are safe. This is different. This could work. But another part is holding on to old narratives that say, this is how it starts and this is how it ends. And when those two voices compete, the louder one is usually the one rooted in past pain. So instead of moving toward healing, they move toward distance. Not because healing isn't possible, but because healing requires them to sit with discomfort they've spent years avoiding. You become the point where everything converges: the past they haven't resolved and the future they're not sure they can handle. And that's a heavy place to stand. What's important to understand here is that you're not causing these reactions or revealing them. Your presence is simply creating the conditions where those unresolved parts can no longer stay hidden. And for someone who has built their identity around control and emotional self-protection, that level of exposure can feel destabilizing. So they retreat, they create space. They may even convince themselves that the connection is the problem, when in reality, it's the emotions the connection is bringing to the surface that feel unmanageable. And this is where many connections begin to fracture, not because there isn't potential, but because the emotional cost of facing oneself feels too high. Because growth, real growth, requires a willingness to move through discomfort without escaping it. And if someone hasn't developed that capacity, they will default to what feels familiar, even if it keeps them stuck. So when you notice that your presence seems to trigger confusion, distance, or even subtle resistance, don't misinterpret it as rejection. It's something more complex than that. It's a person encountering parts of themselves they don't yet know how to integrate. And until they're willing to face those parts directly, no amount of external connection will feel fully secure. Because the real conflict isn't between you and them, it's between who they've learned to be and who they would have to become to sustain something real. And that's the truth most people don't say out loud. Sometimes the connection doesn't fail because it wasn't strong enough. Sometimes it fails because it asked someone to grow in ways they weren't ready to accept. And if you follow this pattern far enough, you arrive at a realization that is both subtle and deeply important. It's not that they don't see you wits, that they don't know how to choose you in a way that sustains something real. Because recognition and action are not the same thing. At some level, they understand what you represent. They see the difference in how you show up, the consistency, the emotional clarity, the absence of games. They can feel that this connection isn't built on instability or surface level attraction. It has weight. It has potential. And in quiet moments, when they're not overwhelmed by their own defenses, they know that. But knowing something and being able to move toward it are two very different capacities. This is where the conflict becomes less about fear and more about limitation. Not a limitation of intelligence or awareness, but of emotional skill. Because choosing someone in a meaningful way requires more than desire. It requires the ability to tolerate vulnerability, to communicate honestly, to remain present when things become uncertain or intense. And those are precisely the areas where avoidants often feel the least equipped. So what you start to see is hesitation. Not loud, dramatic resistance, but subtle delays. They don't fully commit, but they don't fully walk away either. They keep the connection in a kind of undefined space where it doesn't demand too much of them, but also doesn't disappear. From the outside, it can feel like indecision. From the inside, it feels like standing at the edge of something they don't trust themselves to handle. Because choosing you would mean stepping into a version of themselves that they haven't fully developed yet. A version that can stay present during emotional discomfort. A version that can express needs instead of suppressing them. A version that doesn't default to distance when things feel uncertain. And that's not a small shift, it's a fundamental change in how they relate to connection itself. So instead, they try to manage the situation without fully entering it. They stay close enough to keep the connection alive, but distant enough to avoid the responsibility that comes with it. It's not intentional manipulation, it's an attempt to navigate something they don't feel prepared for. But this creates a quiet tension that builds over time. Because real connection doesn't thrive in ambiguity. It requires clarity, direction, and a willingness to move forward even when there's risk involved. And risk is exactly what they're trying to minimize. What makes this even more complex is that they may genuinely believe they're doing the right thing. By not fully committing, they think they're protecting both themselves and you. They assume that if they don't go too deep, they won't cause damage. But in reality, the lack of clarity becomes its own form of harm because you're left trying to understand something that isn't being clearly expressed, and they're left carrying a connection they don't know how to define. This is the space where potential often fades not because it wasn't real, but because it wasn't acted upon with enough intention. And here's the difficult truth. Seeing someone's value does not automatically translate into choosing them. Appreciation without action remains incomplete. Awareness without movement creates stagnation. So when you find yourself wondering if they know what this is, why aren't they stepping into it? The answer is not always about you. It's about whether they have the internal capacity to follow recognition with responsibility. Because choosing someone in the truest sense is not a feeling, it's a decision backed by behavior. It's consistency over time. It's showing up even when it's uncomfortable. It's staying engaged when old instincts say to withdraw. And if someone hasn't built that capacity within themselves, no amount of external connection will compensate for it. So they remain in between, aware of what's possible, but unsure of how to reach it. Wanting the outcome, but avoiding the process required to create it. And that's where the quiet tragedy exists. Not in the absence of feeling, but in the absence of follow through. Because in the end, it's not enough to recognize something meaningful you have to be able to step into it, hold it, and take responsibility for what it requires. And if someone isn't ready for that, the connection doesn't disappear, it simply remains unrealized, existing more in potential than in reality. And just when it seems like the tension couldn't go any deeper, you begin to see the core fear that drives so much of this behavior. It's not simply the fear of losing you. In many cases, that fear is secondary. The primary fear, the one that operates quietly beneath everything else, is the fear of losing themselves. Because for someone who has built their entire emotional framework around independence, control, and self-reliance, closeness can feel like erosion, not of the relationship, but of their identity. You have to understand, avoidants don't just value independence, they anchor themselves in it. It's how they've made sense of the world. It's how they've maintained stability in situations where emotional reliance may have once felt unsafe or unpredictable. Over time, that independence becomes more than a preference, it becomes protection. So when a connection begins to deepen, it doesn't just introduce intimacy, it introduces a perceived threat to that protection. They start to feel the subtle shifts. They think about you more. They consider your perspective. Your presence begins to influence their emotional state. And while this is a natural part of any meaningful connection, to them it can feel like a loss of control. Because now their internal world is no longer entirely self-contained. And that's where the discomfort begins to grow. Not because they don't want connection, but because connection requires interdependence. It requires allowing another person to matter in a way that affects your decisions, your emotions, your sense of stability. And for someone who has spent years avoiding that level of emotional integration, it can feel disorienting. So they begin to create distance, not necessarily to leave, but to recalibrate, to remind themselves that they still exist independently of the connection, that they can still function without relying too heavily on someone else. From the outside, it might look like withdrawal, but internally, it feels like self-preservation, because there's a belief operating underneath it all, often unspoken, but deeply ingrained. If I get too close, I'll lose who I am. And that belief doesn't come from nowhere. It's usually shaped by past experiences where closeness may have led to enmeshment, loss of boundaries, or emotional overwhelm. So now, even healthy connection gets filtered through that same lens. They're not distinguishing between losing themselves and sharing themselves. To them, it feels like the same thing. This is why you might notice that just as things begin to feel stable, they pull back. Not because something went wrong, but because something started to feel too right, too connected, too influential. And influence, in their mind, is a step toward dependency. So they instinctively move in the opposite direction. They reclaim space. They reassert independence. They create emotional distance, not to end the connection, but to reduce its intensity. But here's where the conflict becomes unavoidable. In trying to protect their sense of self, they risk losing the very connection. That could have expanded it, because healthy relationships don't erase identity, they evolve it. They don't demand that you disappear, they invite you to grow. But if someone has never experienced that kind of dynamic, they won't naturally trust it. They'll default to what feels safe, even if it limits them. And this creates a quiet but persistent tension. They feel the value of the connection, but they also feel the pressure it places on their identity. They want to stay, but they also want to retreat. They don't want to lose you, but they're more afraid of losing themselves. So they choose distance, not because it's what they truly want, but because it's what they know how to manage. And over time, this pattern reinforces itself. The more they pull away to protect their independence, the more they prevent themselves from experiencing a connection that could redefine what independence actually means. Because true independence isn't about isolation, it's about having a strong enough sense of self that you can connect deeply without feeling like you're disappearing. But until that understanding is internalized, the fear remains. And that's the deeper truth behind their behavior. They're not just guarding their heart, they're guarding their identity. And when someone believes that love might cost them who they are, they won't. Just hesitate, they'll hold back, even when everything in them wants to move forward. And when you bring all of these dynamics together, the fear of vulnerability, the resistance to closeness, the struggle with identity, the hesitation to fully choose, you arrive at what may be the most defining conflict of all. It's quiet, often invisible, but incredibly powerful. They hope you'll stay while simultaneously preparing for you to leave. This is not something they usually say out loud. In many cases, they're not even fully conscious of it. But it shows up in the way they relate to time, to connection, to expectation. There's a part of them that genuinely wants this to work. They want the consistency, the understanding, the presence you bring. They feel the difference. They recognize that this connection is not easily replaceable. But alongside that hope, there's another layer running in the background, a kind of emotional contingency plan. A quiet assumption that at some point, something will shift, that you'll get tired, that you'll see their inconsistency, their distance, their inability to fully meet you where you are, and you'll eventually walk away. And because that possibility feels so real to them, they start preparing for it long before anything has actually gone wrong. This is where self-protection becomes self-sabotage. Instead of fully leaning into the connection, they begin to hold part of themselves back. Not all at once, not in a way that's obvious, but in small incremental ways. They don't fully open. They don't fully rely. They keep a certain emotional distance, not because they don't care, but because they're bracing for impact. It's a psychological strategy. If I don't give everything, it won't hurt as much if it ends. But what makes this dynamic so complex is that the very behaviors meant to protect them often create the outcome they fear. The distance, the inconsistency, the lack of clarity, it doesn't preserve the connection, it strains it. It creates confusion on your side, frustration, emotional fatigue, and over time, that can lead to exactly what they were trying to avoid you pulling away. So in trying to avoid abandonment, they unknowingly participate in the conditions that make it more likely. This is what's known as a self-fulfilling pattern. The belief that people don't stay influences behavior in a way that makes staying difficult. Not because the connection wasn't real, but because it wasn't allowed to fully stabilize. And underneath that pattern is something deeper than logic. It's expectation shaped by experience. If someone has internalized the idea that connection eventually leads to loss, they won't approach it with full openness. They'll approach it with caution, with restraint, with an underlying sense of impermanence. So even in moments where things feel good, where there's closeness, laughter, understanding, there is still a part of them that's scanning for signs of change, looking for evidence that confirms what they already believe. And when you live in that state, it's very difficult to fully receive what's in front of you, because you're not just experiencing the present, you're anticipating the end of it. That anticipation creates a kind of emotional split. One part of them is engaged, present, even hopeful. The other part is already detaching, already preparing, already rehearsing how to cope when it's over. So they live in both realities at once: connection and exit, presence and withdrawal, hope and resignation. And that duality is exhausting because it prevents them from ever fully settling into the relationship. It keeps them slightly outside of it. Even when they're physically and emotionally involved, there's always a layer of distance, a subtle reservation, a sense that they're not entirely all in. But here's the deeper truth. You cannot experience the full depth of connection while simultaneously preparing for its loss. Those two states are incompatible. And until someone is willing to challenge the belief that connection inevitably leads to abandonment, they will continue to hold back, not because they want to lose what they have, but because they don't trust it to last. So when you feel that hesitation, that partial presence, that sense that they're not fully stepping in, understand what you're seeing. You're not witnessing a lack of feeling, you're witnessing a person trying to protect themselves from a future that hasn't happened, at the cost of a present that could have been real. And that's the final contradiction. They hope you'll be the one who stays, but they relate to you as if you're already leaving. And when someone lives that way, they don't just risk losing the connection, they prevent themselves from ever fully experiencing it. By the time you step back and look at all of this together, the pattern becomes clear. What looks like confusion is often conflict. What feels like rejection is often protection. And what appears to be a lack of love is, in many cases, an inability to handle the weight of something real. Because when an avoidant meets someone who is different, someone grounded, patient, emotionally present, it doesn't just create connection. It creates a crossroads. One path leads toward growth, vulnerability, and a redefinition of everything they thought they needed to stay safe. The other leads back to familiarity, distance, control, and emotional self-containment. And most people, when faced with that choice, don't choose based on what's better. They choose based on what they know. That's the part that's difficult to accept. You can be everything they needed, everything they recognized, everything they felt deeply connected to, and still not be chosen in the way you deserve. Not because you were lacking, but because they were unprepared. Because real connection doesn't just require feeling, it requires capacity. The capacity to stay present when it's uncomfortable. The capacity to move closer when every instinct says to pull away. The capacity to let go of old identities in order to experience something new. And if that capacity isn't there, the connection doesn't disappear, it just never fully forms. So the question isn't just whether they felt something, The question is whether they were ready to become someone who could hold on to it. And that's where clarity replaces confusion. You stop trying to decode their behavior and you start understanding their limitations. You stop personalizing their distance and you start recognizing their internal conflict. And most importantly, you stop waiting for potential to turn into action. Because at the end of the day, connection is not defined by